Hello, and welcome to Inyo Pool's how-to guide section. This is part 2 of how to replace the bearings in a pool pump motor. In part 1, we covered the disassembly of the motor and removal of the bearings. In this video, we will go over the steps to install new bearings and reassemble your motor. Step 1. Install new bearings. Before you install your new bearings, it's a good idea to double-check the part number to make sure you have the right ones. For the Hayward Super Pump in this video, both the front and rear bearings are the same, but some motors are different. Start installing the front bearings on the front of the shaft assembly. Stand the shaft and rotor up on the back end of the shaft and line up the bearing over the top. Take a 1/2-inch pipe and tap the bearing down to the retainer clip. The pipe should only contact the inner race of the bearing. If the pipe is too large in diameter, it may push on the outer race of the bearing and cause damage. Using a pair of external ring pliers, spread the snap ring open to slide it onto the shaft so it snaps back into the groove, just in front of the bearing. Proceed to press on the rear bearing using the same procedure used to press on the front bearing. Step 2. Reassemble motor. After installing the front and rear bearings, you can begin to put the motor back together. Start by placing the bearing locking clip in place and partially screwing it down with a small bolt. Next, push the front end bell onto the shaft until the front bearing is completely in the bearing well. After this is done, you may now completely tighten down the locking clip. The edge of the clip will rotate over the side of the bearing, locking it in place. Next, insert the rear bearing load spring through the windings in the shell until it rests at the bottom of the rear bearing well. Insert the rotor and shaft assembly into the motor shell until the rear bearing is completely in the rear well. Line up the marks on the shell and end bells so that the motor is in the same configuration as before it was dismantled. Continue on by screwing the 4 through bolts through the rear of the motor and into the front end bell. These bolts should screw in easily if the markings that you previously made are lined up correctly. Once these bolts are in place, screw the governor bracket back onto the motor shaft. Next, force the governor weight back into the governor bracket. You may have to spread the sides of the bracket slightly to slide the weight into its pivot holes. Using a pair of small needle nose pliers, attach the springs on the posts of the bracket and weight. After the governor has been reassembled, reattach and secure the V-switch. If your motor was produced before November 2001, the V-switch may need to be adjusted for best operation. See our guide, How to Adjust the V-switch on a Hayward Super Pump Motor, for detailed instructions. Reposition the capacitor and screw the holding bracket down. Move to the front of the motor and replace the water slinger on the front end of the motor shaft. Reattach the motor mounting plate. Make sure the top label is positioned at the top of the motor. Next, reattach the motor seal plate onto the motor mounting plate. Again, make sure the top label is positioned at the top of the motor. It's now time to screw on the impeller. Secure the back end of the motor shaft with a wrench to keep the shaft from spinning. Screw the impeller onto the front of the shaft in a clockwise direction. Hand tight is sufficient. Replace the electrical cover at the rear of the motor and secure it with screws. Next, snap on the diffuser on the front of the motor, making sure the top label is aligned with the top label of the seal plate. You can now proceed to slip the motor into the pump housing and secure with the required bolts. This completes the installation of bearings and reassembly of the motor and pump. To check that everything went together correctly and that the new bearings are lined up, change the pump power configuration to 115 volts, attach a power cord, and plug the pump in a 115 volt bench wall socket for a few seconds to hear if the motor is running smoothly. Remember to change the pump's power back to 220 volts if your pump normally operates at 220 volts. If you have any additional questions, please feel free to call us toll-free at 1-877-372-6038 or visit us online at www.inyopools.com.